Hi, welcome to the Ohio Adult Allies on-demand learning event titled Introduction to Identifying Intervening Variables, which are also referred to as root causes. This on-demand learning opportunity is presented by the Ohio Adult Allies Training and Technical Assistance Team. My name is Jessica Kalura, and I will be facilitating today's learning event. The learning objectives for this webinar are for adult allies to be able to identify potential intervening variables for ATOD use and mental health, list appropriate sources of evidence for determining intervening variables, which again are sometimes referred to as root causes, and third, to illustrate the decision-making process for determining if sufficient data exists to identify those intervening variables or root causes. Our role as adult allies is to support and guide young people as they engage in the overarching goal of youth-led programs. As a reminder, that overarching goal is for young people to collectively engage in a planning process to create and implement a strategic plan that uses evidence-based strategies to create community-level change. In order to accomplish this goal, adult allies structure their youth-led programs as community-based processes and guide their young people through three core steps. The first step is to determine a problem of practice. The second is to identify the root causes. And the third is to select and implement evidence-based strategies to address those root causes. It's important to note that these steps are also the sequence in which decisions should be made. What I mean by this is that you must first complete step one and make a decision about your problem of practice before moving on to the second step, which is identifying the root causes. Similarly, you must determine and make a decision about which root causes your group will seek to address before moving on to that third and final step. Today's on-demand learning opportunity focuses specifically on the second step, identifying those root causes or intervening variables of the problem of practice that your youth-led program selects. If you as an adult ally are ready to engage your young people in this step, the assumption is that your youth have already used data to determine your problem of practice. Once the problem of practice has been determined, your group is ready to move on to the next step of identifying the root causes of the problem. Before we dive into the core content for today's learning opportunity, let's begin with a brief refresher of what that first step is, determining a problem of practice. As a reminder, you should be using local quantitative data in order to determine a problem of practice. Quantitative data is referring to numbers. So the problem of practice that you select may be something like marijuana use, prescription drug misuse, or anxiety and depression. If you look at the Oh Yes survey, which is a source for quantitative data, or other surveys, you may notice there are many questions pertaining to the problem behaviors that I just mentioned: marijuana use, prescription drug, alcohol. What's important to remember is that some of these data may be used to help us determine a problem of practice, while other pieces of these data may be useful to help us determine the root causes. So when you first get the survey, again, for example, the Oh Yes survey, you may look and pull out the measures that pertain to the different problem behaviors that your youth-led program is considering addressing. You should be mindful when you complete this step that not every data point that asks about alcohol use, for example, is necessarily the data that informs the problem of practice. Some of those data pieces may be speaking to the root causes or intervening variables. For problem of practice data, we use consumption behavior or life experience measures. So an example of a consumption measure is, during the past 30 days, did you drink one or more drinks of an alcoholic beverage? Those type of data are what we would use to identify the problem of practice. An example of a behavior measure from the Oh Yes survey is, during the past 30 days, On how many days did you text or email while you were driving a car or other vehicle? For mental health data, we also look to life experiences to help determine the problem of practice. An example of one such measure from the OES survey would be during the past 12 months, did you ever feel so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in a row that you stopped doing some usual activities? Once you've identified the data that you use for your problem of practice, you'll notice that it's also important to make sure that the measure is something that's measured or assessed locally over time. This is because ultimately your youth-led program will monitor this local measure to assess the impact of their efforts in the local community. On the youth-driven strategic plan map, the problem of practice also becomes the longer-term outcome that you monitor or evaluate the effects of your efforts. As I just mentioned, it's for this reason that it's necessary that your problem of practice is tracked over time so you can assess the outcomes of your work. Once the problem of practice has been determined, your group is ready to move on to the next step in the planning process, identifying the root causes of the problem. I'd like to pause momentarily and ask you to think about or jot down some of the reasons you think it's important for young people to consider the root causes associated with their identified problem of practice. So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, just spend some time thinking about why it's necessary and important for youth to consider those root causes that are associated with their problem of practice. A nice visual to illustrate the importance of intervening variables or root causes is to consider the roots of trees. The roots form the basis for the problem to grow. Similarly, the intervening variables are the roots that allow the problem behavior to grow in your community. It's why the problem is occurring, and we must address these factors in order to ultimately address the problem. Identifying the root causes is one of the most important steps in the planning process. Oftentimes, groups of community members, regardless of their age, determine a problem they'd like to address and then immediately begin brainstorming ideas of what they can do to address that problem. This leads to solutions that may not address the real cause of the problem and therefore will not be effective. It is from root causes that groups should determine what they will do because the root causes explain why the behavior is happening. This helps to ensure the strategies selected actually address one or more of the reasons behind the behavior in the community. So the root causes drive the selection of strategies. But what are examples of root causes or intervening variables? And what type of data can we use to identify them in our community? In order to answer the first question, what are possible root causes? We can utilize the literature base as a starting point. Two sources in particular are helpful in identifying root causes. Hawkins, Catalano, and Miller's classic piece on risk and protective factors provides us with a basis for the root causes that contribute to alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. And the National Research Council and Institute of Medicine's report, Preventing Mental, Emotional, and Behavioral Disorders Among Young People, provides additional information about potential root causes for mental health issues aside from genetic factors. So let's look at some classic intervening variables or indicators for alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. As you can see displayed on your screen, we have several listed. Some of the intervening variables for consideration for ATOD use include the following: perception of parental disapproval or attitude, perception of peer disapproval or attitude, perception of risk or harm, family communication around the substance, access and availability to the substance, community laws and norms that may be perhaps permissible or favorable towards drug use, product pricing and promotion, and early initiation of use. That last item, early initiation of use, often we see community groups want to use that as data to support their problem of practice. So I wanted to call attention here to note that those data are used as indicators for root causes. In addition, some potential root causes for mental health issues include connectedness to others or lack thereof, inclusive approaches that increase acceptance and reduce stigma, opportunities to contribute to the community, supportive environments or nurturance, and modifiable lifestyle factors such as sleep and nutrition. This list, of course, is not exhaustive, but provides some potential root causes you may consider if seeking to address the issue of mental health in your community. Now that we have a preliminary understanding of what root cause indicators are, we need to answer our second question. What types of data may we use to determine root causes or intervening variables? Our training and technical assistance team, with input from adult allies, developed a resource that we refer to as the intervening variable flowchart to help answer this question and guide adult allies through the process of determining whether or not they have sufficient data to make a decision about the root causes in their community. This is a tool that was developed for adult allies to support their skills in guiding young people through the identification of intervening variables. Oftentimes when we develop tools, we know that sometimes adult allies want to hand them off or pass them to young people. So we want to make sure that it's clear that the tool that was developed is really to guide you as a facilitator in thinking through the decisions and what you need to discuss and present to your young people. Displayed on your screen now, you'll see an image of the intervening variable flowchart. It may be slightly hard to read all of it on the screen, so this is a nice time to also call attention to the fact that the handout, along with the slides from today's on-demand learning opportunity, is also available on the website where you found this on-demand webinar. It may be useful to print those resources so that you can follow along with them and take some notes as we go through and describe this flowchart. So the first step in the process is determining what evidence currently exists in the community that young people may use as the basis for determining intervening variables. The evidence or data used to identify intervening variables can be either qualitative or quantitative. With the problem of practice, remember, we use quantitative measures. With the intervening variables, a distinction is that you may use either quantitative or qualitative data, or a combination of both. So you may use local survey results, such as results from a countywide or school-wide OES survey, or you may use data from focus groups conducted locally, assuming, of course, that they asked information that pertains to the potential root causes associated with the problem of practice that your young people selected. If local data are not available, you may consider using statewide data or national data. You may also consider the scientific literature, such as the Catalano and Hawkins risk and protective factors. When determining intervening variables, you may also consider recent community experiences. For example, if students recently passed away from a car crash and an investigation found that the youth involved purchased alcohol as minors from a local vendor. This may lead you to want to do or to select something around access and availability as your intervening variable based on that community experience, which is likely documented through news channels and outlets. You may also consider community expectations or what the community is ready to address. For example, your young people may feel more comfortable based on the community and ready to address merchant sales to minors, for example, rather than parental norms. You may choose to use a combination of these types of evidence. You do not need to limit your group to only one. Once you've gathered all the existing data or evidence, the next step is to determine if this is enough evidence about the potential root causes of the identified problem of practice. So that's where you see that your task then is to answer the question, do we have enough evidence? If the answer is yes, young people should be guided through a decision-making process in order to select the intervening variable. If the answer is no, the next step is to identify why you and or your young people believe there is not enough data. So we answer that first question of, do we have enough evidence to make a decision around our intervening variables? We're going to move on to if that answer is no. If the answer is no, the next thing you must ask is, why do we think we don't have enough data? Based on the experiences of adult allies, we've identified some possible reasons for determining there is not enough data. One possible reason may be that the problem of practice is very new, so there isn't existing intervening variable data on it. This was the case with many groups over the past 2 years in particular, for groups that may have selected vaping as their problem of practice. They quickly ran into an issue that there weren't enough data available around intervening variables for vaping. You may also determine that the existing data or evidence you have is insufficient to base decisions off of. So you may say there is data available, but we see issues with these data. Some of the reasons may be that data are not current, perhaps the data aren't local, it may be anecdotal, or you do not have access to all of the existing data. These are just potential reasons why you may determine that the data you have isn't enough. Regardless of the reason, the next key decision is to determine if you need to collect primary evidence yourselves. Primary evidence is the immediate local data from the population you are interested in. In the case of youth-led programs, the priority population is often middle and or high school aged youth in your community. So this is the point where you make the decision. We know we've said we don't have enough. Here's the reason why. Now you're wondering, do we need to collect the primary data directly from our priority population? Your group may respond no to this question if they feel they are able to get secondary data from local partners, such as health departments. They may also choose to do a thorough review of other secondary sources, such as state and national data, or to conduct a literature review in order to gather additional evidence. So they may at this stage decide we don't need to collect primary evidence, but we would like to do a more extensive search for secondary evidence that we can use to inform our decision-making process around root causes. If the answer is yes, then your next step is to determine if you're going to collect the data quantitatively using the tool of a survey with survey options as responses, or qualitatively using data collection techniques that may include focus groups, listening sessions, or even photo voice. Remember, for the problem of practice, we need quantitative data, but for intervening variables, we may use either quantitative or qualitative data. There is no right answer of what you select here. It really is based on the conversations, the interests, the abilities of your young people, of what they feel would be most valuable at this stage. But in order to determine whether or not it should be quantitative or qualitative, there are some factors that you may want to raise for your young people to consider to help them make the decision of which one makes more sense. Some of these factors include the amount of time you have to collect the data, the funds available for data collection, whether your authorizing environment prefers or even dictates a particular method may be used. So if your young people are looking to create or to collect data in a school environment, for example, the principal or superintendents are part of that authorizing environment, and it may be necessary to check in with them to see if either of the methods are allowed. You should also consider, as we mentioned before, both the skills and the interests of your young people, and the fit of the method with the purpose of the questions you need answered. Sometimes some forms of data collection lend themselves better to answering certain types of questions than others. So these are all the factors that you can use and think through as you make the decision with your young people as to whether or not a survey or some sort of qualitative method like focus group or listening session should be conducted. After you've made the decisions at this next level and have either acquired your primary or secondary data, you again need to determine if enough evidence exists to begin the decision-making process. If the answer is no, then you need to return to the question of what additional evidence is needed. If the answer is yes, then it's time to move through the decision-making process. Some additional considerations your young people may consider when selecting the intervening variables they will be focusing on include the community readiness and also their capacity to address the intervening variables. So how feasible is it? Once you have completed the process of guiding your young people through the selection of intervening variables or root causes based on the existing evidence that you have, it's important that you as an adult ally then enter this information onto the youth-driven strategic plan map. Similar to how the problem of practice map is mirrored in the longer-term outcomes, the identified intervening variables or root causes can be turned into measurable short-term outcomes that are anticipated to result from implementing the evidence-based strategies. So you can see where on your strategic plan map you would insert your intervening variables and how this then gets mirrored on the other side of the map in that short-term outcomes column. We're going to discuss now a little bit about how you should present your intervening variables on the strategic plan map. So when you go to present the intervening variables on the strategic plan map, it's important that you document the evidence that backs your selection for your intervening variable. As we see here, again, it can be quantitative or qualitative data, but it's important, what matters is that the source of where you are drawing this evidence from is documented. So what we mean by this is you may list the survey name and the date, the research article, the focus groups, but you should put in parentheses some sort of indication of the name and date of the source that you are using. Once you've documented your intervening variables on the strategic plan map, it is time to move on to that third step of selecting and implementing evidence-based strategies. As we see depicted here, it is the intervening variables that drive decision-making for the evidence-based strategies. This is when it's particularly important to remain focused and not fall into the common trap of going back to your problem of practice to select the strategy. We encourage you to review our other on-demand learning opportunity titled Introduction to Selecting Evidence-Based Strategies to learn more about how your selection with your intervening variables then drives the decisions that you make as you select the appropriate evidence-based strategies to implement in your local community. That concludes today's on-demand learning opportunity. Thank you for your time and dedication to empowering young people to address the pressing issues facing their communities.